Richard Morgan slammed both palms flat on Claire's kitchen table so hard the coffee mugs rattled to the floor, and he leaned into her face and said, "You are nothing without me. You have never been anything without me. And if you ever try to leave, I will make sure everyone in this town knows exactly who you really are." Claire didn't cry. She didn't argue. She simply looked at the broken mug on the floor and thought, he is right about one thing. Something is broken. But it isn't me. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart pounding, please take 1 second to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. And drop a comment right now telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. Ethan Walker had learned the hard way that quiet was not the same thing as peace. There is a difference between a man who is calm and a man who has simply run out of things to fight for. Ethan had been the second kind for a long time. He was 48 years old. He lived alone in a house that used to hold more laughter than it did now. He worked with his hands because hands don't lie. Wood tells you exactly where it's damaged, and if you are patient enough, you can fix it. People are more complicated. People will smile at you while they're falling apart on the inside, and sometimes you won't notice until it's too late. I knew that from experience. His wife Sandra had died 6 years ago. Not suddenly. Not in the way people imagine when they hear that sentence. It had been a long illness, a slow goodbye stretched across 18 months of hospital visits and quiet conversations in rooms that smelled like antiseptic and false hope. When she finally passed, Ethan had not felt what people expected him to feel. He didn't collapse. He didn't rage at the universe. He just felt the silence move into his house the way cold air moves under a door, gradually, persistently, until it fills every corner. He rebuilt himself the way he rebuilt furniture, slowly, with patience, one joint at a time. He started working from home full-time, converting the garage into a workshop where he restored antique pieces for clients across the Southeast. Chairs, cabinets, tables, wardrobes, things that other people had given up on. He had a reputation for taking the ones everyone else called hopeless. He liked that about himself. It wasn't a hobby, it was a philosophy. He also kept his family cabin at Lake Lure, about 40 minutes east of Asheville, in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He'd inherited it from his father, who had inherited it from his. 3 generations of Walker men going up to that lake to think things through. Ethan went maybe 4 or 5 times a year, usually alone, usually when the world started feeling too loud. The cabin didn't have Wi-Fi by choice. It had a wood stove, 2 fishing rods, a dock that needed constant repairs, and the kind of silence that actually does mean something. That was his life, and it was, if not exactly full, at least honest. Then Claire Morgan moved in across the street. He noticed her the first week, not because she was beautiful though she was, but because of the way she carried groceries from the car. She made 3 trips when she could have made 2, and she always looked back at the house before she went inside. A quick glance, the kind of glance that tells you someone is checking to see if they're being watched. Ethan had seen that look before on animals that live near predators, a constant low-level alertness that never fully switches off. Her husband, Richard Morgan, introduced himself 2 days after they moved in. He came across the street with a bottle of wine and a handshake that lasted exactly 1 second too long, the kind of handshake that is actually a quiet demonstration of strength. Richard was 52, broad-shouldered hair, perfectly groomed, the sort of man who made sure you knew within 3 sentences what kind of car he drove and what kind of deals he closed. He had the practiced charm of someone who has spent decades learning exactly what to say to make people feel good about themselves, right up until the moment he needed them to feel something else. "Beautiful neighborhood," Richard had said, looking at Ethan's house with an expression that suggested he had already assessed its value and found it slightly beneath his standards. "It is," Ethan had agreed. They never had a real conversation after that, but Claire and Ethan, that was different. It started small, the way things do. She waved from the porch one morning while he was carrying a restored cabinet to his truck. He lifted his chin in acknowledgement. A week later, she asked him over the hedge if he knew a good hardware store nearby because the latch on her garden gate was sticking. He came over and fixed it himself in about 6 minutes. She made him a cup of coffee and said thank you, in the way you say thank you when you're not used to people helping you without wanting something back, a little surprised, a little careful. I didn't think much about it at the time. What he thought about later was the detail he noticed while fixing the gate. Her garden was immaculate. The kind of garden that takes hours to maintain, that you tend to when you need something you can control. And on the porch table, there was a journal closed with a pen tucked into it, and a coffee cup that had gone cold, meaning she had been sitting there for a long time before coming to say hello. He noticed these things the way he noticed stress fractures in old wood, not because he was looking for them, because he had learned to pay attention. Over the next few months, they developed what you might call a neighborly rhythm. She brought him baked goods pie usually, which he suspected she made because baking was one of those private activities a person can do without needing to explain it to anyone. He fixed things: her porch swing, a squeaking door hinge, a drawer in her kitchen that had swollen and wouldn't close properly. He wasn't doing it to get close to her. He was doing it because he was good at fixing things, and because every time he came over, she seemed genuinely lighter for an hour or two, and he found that he didn't mind being the reason for that. But he kept his distance, deliberately, carefully, because he was not a stupid man and he knew exactly what Richard Morgan was. He had seen Richard leave at 7 in the morning and return at 9 at night 3 days in a row, and when he returned, the lights in the house would sometimes go off very quickly and very completely in the way that tells you someone has gone silent rather than gone to sleep. He had heard twice the low rumble of a male voice through the open bathroom window. Not the words, just the tone, the relentless, sustained pressure of a voice that has learned it doesn't need to shout to cause damage. He had also seen Claire the mornings after, not bruised, not visibly harmed, but diminished, like something had been turned down inside her. The light behind her eyes on a dimmer switch just one notch lower than it had been before. He understood what that was. He had seen it before in his own mother, a long time ago, in a different house, in a different life, the way a person can be reduced so gradually that they can't identify the moment it happened. They only know that one day they look in the mirror and don't quite recognize who they see. Ethan never said any of this out loud, because it wasn't his place, because he wasn't certain, because she hadn't asked him. And then one afternoon in late September, Claire came over with a peach pie which she set down on his workbench like an offering, and then she didn't leave. She stood in the middle of his workshop, looking at the half-restored armchair in the corner, and she said, "How do you know when something is worth saving?" He had looked up from the joint he was working on. "What do you mean?" "I mean, when you look at a piece of furniture, how do you know if it's worth putting in the time, if it's fixable?" "I look at the bones," he said. "If the core structure is sound, you can fix the rest. Surface damage is just surface damage. But if the bones are compromised, you have to ask yourself a harder question." She had been quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What's the harder question?" "Whether what you're trying to save still wants to be what it was." She had looked at him, then really looked at him, and he had the strange feeling that they weren't talking about furniture anymore, and he suspected they both knew it and neither of them was going to say so directly, not yet. She stayed for 2 hours. They talked about things that had nothing to do with marriages or furniture. She told him she had grown up in Charlotte, that her mother had been a school teacher, that she had wanted to study journalism in college, but had been persuaded, she used that word carefully, persuaded in a way that suggested the persuasion had not been entirely gentle to study business administration instead, because it was more practical, because it would serve her better. She had met Richard in her junior year. They were married at 26. She was 44 now. Ethan did the math quietly and said nothing. She asked about Sandra. He told her. Not everything, but enough. The illness, the long goodbye, the strange silence of a house that used to hold 2 people and now only holds 1. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "The time, the 18 months. "No," he said immediately, "not for a second. Even though it hurt. Especially because it hurt. The things that don't hurt you don't mean much." She had nodded slowly, the way people nod when they hear something that lands somewhere deep, and he had the sense that she was filing it away, pressing it between the pages of something important. When she left, she stopped in the doorway of the workshop and turned around. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know for what exactly, but thank you." "You don't have to know," he said. "Come back when you want to not know again." She had laughed real laughter, not the careful social version he usually heard from her, and it had changed her face entirely, and Ethan had turned back to his work and told himself very firmly to be careful. 3 days later, he was loading his truck for the trip to Lake Lure. He had told himself he needed a few days away because autumn was hitting the mountains hard and the fishing was good this time of year, and he had been feeling the weight of too many small things for too long. I was tying down the last cooler when Claire came out of her house and called across the street. Going somewhere, cabin, he said. Lake Lure, couple of days. She leaned against her car with her arms folded and looked at him for a moment. Is that nice up there? It's quiet, he said, which is different from nice, but sometimes that's better. She was quiet herself for a moment, and then without really thinking about it, without planning to say it, Ethan said, sometimes a person needs a place where nobody expects anything from them. He had meant it as a general observation, a vague, harmless, neighborly comment. He turned back to the truck. He heard her go back inside. He finished loading and went to bed. And the next morning at 7:15, he walked out his front door with his coffee and his keys, and Claire Morgan was standing at the end of his driveway. She had a small canvas bag, the kind you pack in a hurry, or the kind you pack after a very long time of thinking, and she was wearing jeans and a dark green jacket, and she looked like someone standing at the edge of a diving board who has already decided to jump but hasn't moved yet. If the invitation still stands, she said. He stared at her. I think I need to breathe again. Her voice was steady. That was the thing that struck him. She wasn't crying, wasn't trembling, wasn't looking over her shoulder at her house. She was simply standing there completely composed, with a level of quiet determination in her eyes that told him this was not an impulse. This was not a woman running away from something in a panic. This was a woman who had thought it through maybe for a long time and had made a decision. He said, Claire, I'm not asking you to rescue me, she said, cutting him off cleanly. I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you already are. I just need a few days where I'm not Richard Morgan's wife. I need to remember what it felt like to just be me. He looked at her for a long moment. I thought about all the reasons this was complicated. He thought about Richard Morgan's handshake and his practiced smile and the way the lights in that house went off too fast. He thought about Claire laughing in his workshop doorway with her whole face. He thought about bones, whether the bones were still sound. There's only one guest room, he said finally. That's fine. There's no Wi-Fi. Even better. The dock needs work. I've been putting it off. I'll help. He picked up her bag. She walked to the passenger side of the truck, and neither of them said anything else for the first 20 minutes of driving, because sometimes the most important decisions don't need words. They just need motion, one foot in front of the other, 1 mile down the road, until the town is behind you, and the mountains are in front of you, and the weight you've been carrying starts just slightly to shift. But here is what Ethan Walker did not know that morning, sitting in the truck with the Blue Ridge Mountains coming into view through the windshield, while Claire looked out the passenger window with her hands folded in her lap. He did not know what Claire had left on the kitchen counter before she walked out of her house. He did not know what Richard was going to find when he came home that evening. He did not know that Claire Morgan had made not one difficult decision that morning, but two. And the second one was going to change everything. They had been on the road for about 40 minutes when Claire turned from the window and looked at him. I need to tell you something, she said. Okay. She looked at her hands, then back at him. Before I say it, I want you to know coming to the cabin, that's not about you. I mean, it is about you in the sense that you're the only person in my life right now who talks to me like I'm a whole person. But I'm not coming because I have feelings for you that I'm planning to act on. I'm not that kind of woman. I know that, Ethan said. Then let me finish. She took a breath. 2 weeks ago, I contacted a lawyer. I've been preparing divorce papers. He kept his eyes on the road. His hands were steady on the wheel. I have been planning to leave Richard for almost 8 months, she continued. I've been building up to it carefully because if you do it wrong, if you give him any advantage, he will use it. He is very good at using things. So I have been careful. I have been patient. And I was almost ready. She paused. And then you said something about needing a place where nobody expects anything. And that made you pack a bag. And that made me pack a bag, she confirmed. Because I realized that the last step I needed wasn't legal, it wasn't financial, it was personal. I needed to remember who I am when no one is watching me, when no one is managing me or defining me. I need to feel what it's like to just exist without all of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What did you leave on the counter? She looked at him sharply. How did you? Because you packed carefully, he said. Your bag is light. You took what you needed. A person doesn't pack that deliberately unless they've thought it through. And a woman who has thought it through doesn't just walk away from a marriage without leaving some kind of marker behind. She was quiet for a long moment. I left him a note, she said finally. Short. I didn't explain. I didn't apologize. I just said that I needed a few days to think, and that when I came back we needed to have a conversation we should have had a long time ago. Ethan absorbed that. He's going to look for you, he said. Yes. He's going to be angry. Yes. He might figure out where you went. He might, she said. Neither of them said anything for a while. The mountains were closer now, rising up ahead of them through the windshield, and the air coming through the vents was already different, cleaner, cooler, carrying the smell of pine and elevation. Claire leaned her head back against the seat. I'm not scared, she said almost to herself. That's the strange part. I keep waiting to feel scared, but I don't. I just feel quiet, Ethan offered. She turned to look at him. Yes, she said softly. Quiet. He nodded. That's how it starts, he said. The real kind. And they drove on through the morning with the mountains rising ahead of them and the town shrinking behind them, and neither of them fully prepared for what those next few days were going to ask of them. Because the thing about deciding to change your life is this: the decision is actually the easy part. It feels enormous in the moment. It feels like the whole weight of it is in the choice. But the choice is just the door. What's on the other side of the door? That's where the real work begins. And for Claire Morgan, the real work was only just starting. She just didn't know yet that her husband was already in the car. Not behind them, not yet. But he would be. And when Richard Morgan arrived at that cabin, when he stepped out of that black SUV onto the gravel road with his practiced calm and his ownership and his certainty that the world would rearrange itself to his preferences, Claire Morgan was going to have to decide something that no one could decide for her. Who she was. Not who Richard said she was. Not who the neighbors assumed she was. Not who Ethan hoped she might become. Who's she? Claire Morgan, 44 years old, daughter of a school teacher from Charlotte, a woman who once dreamed of writing things that mattered, who she actually was down in the bones, and whether those bones were still sound. That question was waiting for her at the end of that gravel road, and so was Richard. But that is the next part of this story. The cabin key had been on Ethan's keyring for so long that the metal was worn smooth on one side. He had driven this road hundreds of times. He knew every curve, every place where the gravel got loose, every spot where the trees opened up just enough to show you a slice of the lake below, like a reward for paying attention. But pulling up to the cabin that morning with Claire Morgan sitting quietly in the passenger seat of his truck, he felt the road differently. Not better or worse. Just different. The way familiar things feel when you bring someone new into them, slightly strange, slightly more vivid, like hearing a song you know well played on an instrument you weren't expecting. He pulled up and cut the engine. Claire didn't move right away. She sat looking through the windshield, and he could see something shifting in her face. Not quite emotion, not quite relief, but something in between. The way a person looks when they have been holding something very tightly for a very long time, and they are just beginning to let their grip loosen. It's real, she said quietly. What is being here? I kept thinking I'd talk myself out of it somewhere on the road. But here we are. Here we are, he said. She picked up her bag. She got out of the truck, and that was that. Inside, Ethan showed her the guest room, small, clean, with a window that faced the water, and he said, there are extra blankets in the closet, and the hot water takes about 2 minutes to come through, so don't give up on it. She nodded and set her bag on the bed and looked around the room the way people look at spaces that belong to other people's histories, respectfully, a little curiously careful not to impose. I'll make coffee, he said, and left her to it. He stood in the kitchen and listened to the cabin settle around them. He could hear her moving in the guest room, the soft sounds of a person unpacking a few things, and he made himself stop listening and focus on the coffee, because there was a version of this situation that he was not going to let happen, not because he wasn't human, not because he didn't notice things about Claire Morgan, but because he had lived long enough and been broken enough to understand that some feelings are not invitations. Some feelings are just the proof that you're still alive, and the responsible thing to do with them is acknowledge them quietly and then go make coffee. She came out 20 minutes later, looking like a different person had moved into her face. Some tension he had so long associated with her that he'd stopped seeing it. It was gone. Her shoulders were different. Her jaw was different. She sat down across from him at the table and wrapped both hands around the coffee mug and closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, just breathing. Then she opened them and said, "Tell me about this place." So he did. He told her about his father bringing him up here at age 10, for the first time a man who didn't talk much, but who believed that silence between two people who trusted each other was its own kind of language. He told her about learning to fish on this lake, about falling in twice, once by accident, and once by deliberate choice, a story that made her laugh out loud. He told her about the winter he'd come up here alone 6 weeks after Sandra died. Just him and 2 feet of snow and a wood stove that had been acting up for years, and how he'd spent 4 days fixing the stove and crying when he felt like it, and not crying when he didn't. And at the end of those 4 days, he had felt something he could only describe as approximately okay, which at that time was more than enough. Claire listened to all of it. She asked questions, real questions, not polite ones. She wanted to know what his father was like. She wanted to know what Sandra had been like. She listened the way some people never learn to listen, with her whole attention, not waiting for her turn to talk, but actually taking in what he was saying and letting it matter. Around noon, she said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask." "Do you ever regret not having children?" I thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "Sandra and I tried for a while. It didn't happen. At a certain point, we decided that what we had was enough. I think she felt more grief about it than I did, honestly. But we made a good life. I don't look at it as something that was taken. I look at it as the life that was ours." Claire was quiet for a moment. "Richard decided we wouldn't have children," she said in a voice that was very level, very careful, the way you say things that cost you something to say. "He decided that before we were married, actually, and told me after. Not asked, told." She looked out the window. "I wasn't sure how I felt about children at the time, but I would have liked to have been asked." The kitchen was very quiet. Ethan set down his coffee mug. "He told you after you were married." 6 months after." She smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. He framed it as a conversation, but it wasn't a conversation. It was a presentation. He had reasons, practical reasons, financial planning reasons, lifestyle reasons. He presented them like a business case. And then he said, "You see why this makes sense, don't you?" Not a question. It was never a question. Ethan said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. "The worst part," Claire continued, "is that I told myself for years that he was right, that it was practical, that I had agreed. I was very good at convincing myself that the choices he made for me were choices I had made for myself." She paused. "It took me an embarrassingly long time to figure out the difference." "It's not embarrassing," Ethan said. "It's human." "Ethan," she looked at him directly, "I went along with it for 18 years. 18 years of yes when I meant no, and fine when I meant nothing is fine. And of course I don't mind when I minded everything. That's not human. That's survival," he said quietly. She stopped. "That's survival," he said again. "When someone systematically takes away your confidence over a long enough period of time, compliance starts to feel like safety. It doesn't mean you were weak. It means you were managing. There's a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. "You know a lot about this," she said. "My mother," he said simply. And that was all he needed to say. She nodded once, slowly, and the understanding that passed between them in that moment wasn't pity, and it wasn't romantic, and it wasn't even entirely comfortable. It was something more precise than any of those things. It was recognition. Two people who had seen the same particular kind of damage from different angles acknowledging each other's knowledge without ceremony. The afternoon moved the way good afternoons move when you're not trying to force them anywhere. They went out to the dock, which did in fact need work. 2 planks were soft, and 1 cleat had pulled halfway free. Ethan got his tools, and Claire held things and handed him what he asked for, and asked questions about what he was doing. Real questions, because she was genuinely curious, and he found himself explaining things in more detail than he would have if he'd been alone. And he noticed that the work went better with someone present. Not easier, better, which is a different thing. While he worked, she talked. Not about Richard. Not about the divorce papers or the lawyer or the note on the kitchen counter. She talked about things she had not talked about in years, possibly because no one had asked, and possibly because she had forgotten they existed. She had wanted to be a writer. She had started a novel at 22. She laughed, saying it a terrible novel, she was certain, but hers. She had put it in a box when she married Richard, because Richard had said gently but unmistakably that writing was for people who couldn't commit to real work, and she had packed the manuscript into a box that she still had in the back of a closet in their house, unopened for 18 years. She loved photography. She had a good eye. People had told her that teachers' friends, but she hadn't picked up a camera in almost a decade because Richard had once looked at her photographs and said, "You always pick the wrong subject," and somehow that one sentence had been enough. She had always wanted to travel to Portugal. She didn't know why Portugal specifically. Something about the light in photographs she'd seen, the way the buildings held color. Richard had dismissed it every time she raised it. Too far, too disorganized, too much walking. Ethan listened to all of this. He kept working with his hands, and he listened, and every now and then he said something, not much, just enough to show that he was still there. He understood that she wasn't telling him these things because she needed his opinion on them. She was telling him because saying them out loud for possibly the first time made them real again, made her real again. Around 5 in the afternoon. Something shifted in her. He felt it more than saw it. She got quieter in a different way, not withdrawn, but settled. The way water settles after you've stopped moving through it. "I haven't talked this much in years," she said. "You were due." "Is it annoying?" "No." "You'd tell me if it was." "I would," he said. "I'm not in the habit of pretending things don't bother me. It wastes time." She smiled at that, and there was something in that smile that he recognized from 2 weeks ago in the workshop doorway, genuine, unguarded, slightly surprised at itself. That evening they cooked together. Nothing elaborate pasta salad bread that Ethan had packed a bottle of red wine that he'd brought for himself and was now sharing without really deciding to. She knew her way around a kitchen in the easy, confident way of someone who has cooked alone more than she has cooked with company, and they moved around each other without bumping, and they talked while they cooked. The way people talk when they're not performing for each other, loosely, easily, finishing sentences or not letting things drop when they dropped. Richard came up twice. Both times Claire was the one who brought him up, and both times she spoke about him the way you speak about a difficult condition. You have been managing not with hatred, not with fear exactly, but with a kind of exhausted clarity. The clarity of someone who has spent a long time seeing something for what it is instead of what they wished it was. "I wasn't always this way," she said over dinner. "Or maybe he was and I didn't see it. I still don't know which is true. In the beginning, the control felt like attention. It felt like someone who cared so much about you that they wanted to be involved in everything. I was 24. I thought that was love." "A lot of people make that mistake," Ethan said. "A lot of people should be warned better," she said with a small edge. "Yeah," he agreed. "They should. The thing is, and I've spent a long time working through this, he never hit me. He never threatened me, not in ways that leave marks. He was never, overtly violent. Yes, which made it very easy to gaslight myself, because I could always say it's not that bad. It's not like that. So what are you complaining about?" She put her fork down. "Do you know what the most insidious thing he ever did to me was?" "What?" "He convinced me that the problem was my perception, not his behavior, my perception. That I was too sensitive, that I misread situations, that my memory of events was unreliable." She paused. "After enough years of that, you start to doubt things that you know. You see it happen, and then you're not sure you saw it. He was very, very good at that." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you still doubt yourself?" She considered the question seriously. "Less than I did. Therapy helped. The lawyer helped, having someone neutral look at the facts and say, yes, this is a pattern, this is real, this has a name. That helped." She picked her fork back up. "Coming here helped. You've only been here 8 hours. 8 hours of not being watched is worth a lot when you've been watched for 18 years. He absorbed that. After dinner, they sat on the dock with what was left of the wine, and the evening came down around them, and the lake went dark and still. There were no boats out. The only sound was the water, and somewhere up the ridge, something moving through the trees. An ordinary night, and yet there was nothing ordinary about it, and they both felt that without saying it. Claire spoke first. "Can I tell you what I'm actually afraid of?" "Yes." "Not Richard. I want to be clear about that. I'm not afraid of Richard anymore. I spent a lot of years being afraid of him, and then one day I realized that the fear itself was something he had installed in me like a program, because fear is useful to a person like him. A frightened person doesn't act. A frightened person just manages." She looked at the water. "What I'm afraid of is myself." "Say more," Ethan said. "I'm afraid that I've spent so long being who he needed me to be that I don't know who I actually am anymore. I'm afraid that the person I was before him, the writer, the photographer, the woman who wanted to go to Portugal, that maybe she doesn't exist anymore, that maybe he took up so much space for so long that she just dissolved. The words sat in the air between them. Ethan turned his wine glass in his hands. "Do you know what I've learned from furniture?" he said. "I feel like this is going to be good. The most damaged pieces I get, the ones that come in looking like there's nothing left, they always still have their grain. The pattern that's been in the wood since the tree was standing. You can damage the surface. You can strip the finish. You can take off layers. But the grain, the fundamental pattern of who that piece of wood is, you cannot remove that. It was there before anyone made anything of it. It's there underneath everything. You just have to get down to it." Claire was very still. "Are you saying I'm like furniture?" she said. He laughed a real laugh, surprised out of him. "I'm saying your grain is still there. Whatever he stripped off, whatever got damaged, that surface, it's real damage and it's worth taking seriously. But underneath it, who you are, that doesn't dissolve. It waits." She looked at him for a long time. "You're a strange man, Ethan Walker," she said softly. "I've been told." "I mean that as a compliment." "I know." She looked back at the water, and then quietly, without drama, her voice steady and certain, she said, "I haven't told anyone this, not even my therapist, not directly, but I need to say it out loud somewhere." She paused. "I don't love Richard. I don't think I have for a very long time. What I have felt, what I've been managing, is something more like accommodation. Like the feeling you get in a house you've lived in so long that you stop noticing the roof is leaking until one day you look up and the ceiling is ruined." She took a slow breath. "I have been looking at a ruined ceiling for years and telling myself the house is fine." Ethan said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. She had said it, out loud, to another human being, under the open sky with the lake in front of her on the first night, in as long as she could remember that she had gone to sleep without being afraid of what the next day would require of her. That night was the first night. The second morning was different. She woke early before him, and he came out to find her sitting at the kitchen table with the old notebook she'd brought in her bag, writing. Not looking up when he came in, not self-conscious, just writing. Her hand moving steadily across the page, her coffee going cold at her elbow, because she had forgotten it was there. He made fresh coffee quietly and set a mug near her without saying anything, and went to work outside. When she came out an hour later, she said, "I forgot what that feels like." "Good. Like breathing all the way out." She wrapped her hands around the new mug. "I haven't written anything real in almost 9 years. I tried a few times over the years, and Richard would always find it somehow always, and he would read it without asking, and then he would say something about it that would make me feel like a child who'd been caught at something embarrassing, and after enough times I just stopped." She looked at the notebook. "This morning I just started. I didn't think about it. I just picked it up and started." "What did you write?" "Things I've been thinking, feelings I've been carrying around. Some of it is about him. Some of it is about me. Some of it is just," she paused, "just me putting down words to see if they still work." "Do they?" She looked at him. "They do," she said with a kind of quiet wonder in her voice that told him the answer had surprised her. They fished that afternoon. Ethan had expected to need to explain fishing to her, but it turned out she had fished with her grandfather as a child, and remembered enough that she didn't need much instruction. What she had lost, or maybe never developed, was patience. She kept moving, the rod adjusting her grip, changing her position, and Ethan finally said, "You're trying to make something happen. Isn't that the point? The point is to be ready when something happens. That's different." She looked at him, then she looked at her rod. Then she went still, deliberately, consciously still, and held the position, and 2 minutes later she had a fish on the line and she was laughing like she was 12 years old, and Ethan sat back in the boat and thought, there she is, and he kept that thought to himself because it wasn't his thought to give to her. The second evening they cooked again and talked again, and this time the conversation went deeper the way conversations do when the surface things have already been covered. She asked him about loneliness, whether he was lonely honestly. He said honestly that there were kinds of loneliness he had learned to live with, and kinds he still found hard, and that the worst kind was not being alone, but being with someone who didn't see you. She had looked at him when he said that with an expression he couldn't quite name, not pity, not recognition exactly. something more like the feeling you get when someone puts into words a thing you have known for years but haven't been able to say. "That's what it was," she said quietly. "That's exactly what it was. The loneliest I've ever been was sitting across the dinner table from Richard." And then it was the third morning, and everything changed. Ethan was outside working on the dock again, replacing the last soft plank when he heard it. Gravel. The sound of tires on the gravel road. He straightened up slowly. The road to the cabin was private. It wasn't on any maps. You had to know it was there to find it, and you had to have a reason to come. In the 3 days since they had arrived, not a single car had come up that road. Not a delivery truck, not a lost driver, not a neighbor. Nobody came up this road unless they were coming specifically here. Ethan turned around, and he saw the black SUV. He recognized it immediately, the way you recognize something you have been half expecting and half dreading, a shape that has been sitting in the back of your mind since the moment certain decisions were made. It was Richard's SUV, black, expensive, clean, despite the gravel dust now settling on it. The kind of vehicle that a man buys to communicate something about himself to everyone around him. It stopped. The engine cut. The door opened. Richard Morgan stepped out onto the gravel road, and he stood looking at the cabin for a moment, and then he looked at Ethan and he smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who has driven for 40 minutes and arrived exactly where he intended to arrive, and is now standing on the ground of his own certainty. The smile of a man who believes he has already won whatever is about to happen. Ethan set down his hammer, and inside the cabin, through the window above the kitchen sink, Claire Morgan turned her head, and she saw the black SUV, and every bit of ease and lightness and quiet that had built up in her over 3 days. He watched it leave her face. Not in fear. Let that be clear. What left her face was not fear. He could see that from 40 feet away. What left her face was the look of a woman who has just been reminded that the world outside this cabin still exists, that the choices she has been building herself towards still need to be made, that the breathing room she came here to find is about to be used for something much harder than breathing. She came to the cabin door. She looked at Richard standing in the driveway. Richard looked at her, and the three of them stood there for a moment in the mountain air, in the quiet that precedes a storm, each of them holding a version of what the next hour was going to cost. Ethan thought, this is the moment. Not the decision. The decision had already been made. What this was the moment where decisions become real, when the note on the kitchen counter stops being words and becomes a life, when the woman who packed a careful bag stops being someone planning to leave and becomes someone who has left. Richard spoke first. "Claire," he said, just her name, in a voice that was perfectly controlled, perfectly pleasant, with just enough edge underneath it to make the pleasantness feel like a warning. And Claire standing in the doorway of a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains with a notebook on the table behind her and a coffee mug at her elbow, and her grain showing through clear and undeniable. Claire looked at her husband and did not move. "Richard," she said, not a greeting, not a surrender, a fact. "I see you. I know who you are. I am not afraid of you anymore." All of that in one word. And Richard Morgan, who was very good at reading rooms and people and power, heard all of it. And his smile did not change, but something behind it did. And Ethan Walker, standing on the dock with his hammer down, thought, "Here we go." Richard Morgan did not walk fast. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. A man who drives 40 minutes in anger and arrives at a destination where his wife is standing in a doorway with another man. That man, most men would cover the ground quickly. Urgency, confrontation, possession. But Richard moved the way. He always moved the way Ethan had observed from across the street for 3 years, deliberately, without hurry, as if the world around him was obligated to wait while he got where he was going. That slowness was not calm. Ethan understood that immediately. It was control. It was a performance of control, which is what a man reaches for when he feels control slipping. Richard stopped about 10 feet from the cabin door, which put him equidistant from both of them, close enough to be heard clearly, far enough to survey the situation. He put his hands in the pockets of his jacket and looked at Claire and then at Ethan and then back at Claire, and he said in a voice that was almost conversational, "I got your note." Claire came down the one step from the doorway onto the gravel. She crossed her arms not defensively, more the way a person crosses their arms when they're settling into a position they intend to hold. "I know," she said. "You didn't leave a number. I didn't think you'd need one to find me." A beat of silence. Something moved across Richard's face, not quite amusement, not quite anger, something between the two that was more unsettling than either. "No," he said. "I didn't." He turned his gaze to Ethan, held it there. "Your neighbor," he said, addressing Claire, but not looking away from Ethan. "I should have introduced myself more properly." Ethan said, "You introduced yourself well enough." Richard's gaze sharpened slightly, just slightly. Then he looked back at Claire. "How long have you two been—" "Don't," Claire said. One word, flat and immediate. "I'm asking a question. You're implying something. Those are different things. And the answer to what you're implying is nothing. We are friends. Ethan offered me space to think. I needed space to think. That is all." Richard turned his body slightly to face Ethan more fully. "She always does this," he said pleasantly conversationally, the way you might explain a minor quirk to a new acquaintance. "She simplifies. She's very good at simplifying. What she calls space to think, I call disappearing without a word after 18 years of marriage. But," he lifted a hand as if conceding a minor point, "that's just a difference of perspective." Ethan looked at him steadily and said nothing. Richard took that silence as an invitation to continue. "You seem like a reasonable man. You restore furniture, right? That's what Claire told me once. You take broken things and fix them." "That's right," Ethan said. "Do you ever take things that aren't yours to fix?" The question landed in the air like something thrown. Ethan felt Claire go still to his left. He said, "In my experience, the piece of furniture doesn't usually have an opinion about whose workshop it's in. People are different." Richard studied him. "People are different," he repeated as if tasting the sentence. "That's an interesting way to put it." He turned back to Claire. "Did he tell you about himself? Did he tell you why he lives alone at 48, rattling around in that house with nobody in it? Did he tell you about—" "Stop," Claire said. "I'm making conversation." "No, Richard. You're doing what you always do. You're looking for an angle. You're looking for something you can use, and I'm telling you right now, there is nothing here to use. Not against me, not against Ethan, so you can drop it." A silence. Richard nodded slowly, as if absorbing new information. "You found your voice," he said. "I never lost it. You just talked over it for long enough that I stopped using it." Something moved across his face then, and this was the thing that Ethan would remember most about that moment. Not anger, not hurt, but something that looked almost like acknowledgement, as if part of him, some buried rational part, knew she was right, and that knowing didn't change anything, because the knowing was too far below the surface to affect the behavior. He said, "Claire, come home." She said no. "You're going to throw away 18 years. "I'm not throwing away anything. There's nothing left to throw. Richard, I have been trying to tell you this for 2 years. You refused to hear it. You reframed it, you redirected it. You turned it into a conversation about my instability, or my expectations, or my failure to appreciate what we had. I am done having that version of the conversation." Richard's voice lost a fraction of its pleasantness, just a fraction. "You haven't exactly been perfect in this marriage either." "No, I haven't. I know exactly where I failed. I've been through it enough times in therapy, but my failures don't cancel your behavior. They're separate things, and you've spent a long time trying to get me to believe that they're connected, that if I had been better, you would have been better. That's not how it works." "Therapy." The word came out clipped, slightly contemptuous. "Yes, therapy. 2 years of it. Which I paid for separately because you would have found a way to use joint finances as leverage, which I went to in the morning while you were at work because I didn't want you to know, which taught me among other things that the fact that I had to do all of that in secret is itself the problem." Richard was quiet. Ethan watched him recalibrate in real time, watched the man who was accustomed to controlling the parameters of every conversation encounter a version of Claire he had possibly never met before, or perhaps met so rarely that he had discounted it, filed it under anomaly. Then Richard said, "Who paid for those divorce papers, Claire?" Ethan went still. Claire's expression didn't change. "Because if you used joint funds—" "I used my freelance income," Claire said evenly. "The account you didn't know about because you would have found a way to close it. I have been very careful, Richard, for a very long time. I know how you operate." The silence that followed that was different from the previous ones. Richard's voice, when it came, had dropped about half an octave, still controlled, still precise, but something underneath it had changed. "You've been planning this." "Yes." "For how long?" "Long enough." "How long, Claire?" 8 months of actively planning, 2 years of knowing it was coming, 18 years of wondering if it could be different. She said it without cruelty, without heat, like reading off data points. Those are the true numbers. Richard turned away from her and took 3 steps toward the tree line. He stood with his back to them for a moment. Ethan watched his shoulders, watched the breath move through him, watched the effort of a man who has invested his entire identity in the belief that he runs his world, standing in a situation he does not run. Then he turned back, and when he turned back, something had shifted. The pleasantness was gone. What replaced it was not quite rage. Richard Morgan was too disciplined for visible rage, but it was something colder and in some ways worse. It was the look of a man who has decided to stop performing and start operating. "You want to do this publicly," he said quietly. "You want to put our marriage in front of lawyers and judges and make it a matter of record. Because I'll tell you what that record is going to show, Claire. It's going to show a woman with a documented history of emotional instability. Richard, a woman who abandoned her husband without cause to spend 3 days in a cabin with another man. That is not. A woman who has been building a secret financial account and consulting attorneys without her husband's knowledge. All of which I did because of things you. A woman," he said, raising his voice for the first time, and the cabin went briefly silent, except for his voice. "Who has never once in 18 years been grateful. Not once. I gave you everything. I gave you a home. I gave you security. I gave you a social standing that you did not come into this marriage with. Your mother was a school teacher in Charlotte. You were a 24-year-old with a business degree you barely used. I gave you a life." "You gave me a cage," Claire said. Her voice was so quiet in the sudden silence that it was somehow louder than everything Richard had said. Richard stopped. She said it again, not because it needed repeating, but because she was listening to herself say it, and it was true, and she wanted to hear how it sounded when she was not afraid. "You gave me a beautiful, well-appointed cage, and you convinced me for 18 years that I should be grateful to be in it. And the worst day of my life wasn't any one fight, or any one cruelty, or any one moment I could point to. The worst day was the day I looked around at everything we had, the house, the reputation, the life, and I realized I was disappearing inside of it, that every year there was a little less of me, that I had come into this marriage with things, dreams, voice, identity, and I had quietly handed all of them over one at a time because you made it clear that they were inconvenient." She took a breath. "That is the truth. That is the whole truth. And you can call it instability or ingratitude or whatever allows you to sleep at night. But I am done living someone else's version of my life." The silence that followed was the longest and the most complete. Richard looked at her. Ethan had been absolutely still throughout all of this, and he stayed still now because this was not his moment, and he knew it. This was Claire's moment. Possibly the moment Claire had been moving toward without knowing it for years. And the most important thing he could do was take up as little space as possible and let it be hers. Richard's gaze moved to Ethan, slowly, deliberately. "You," he said. Ethan met his eyes. "Me. You put these ideas in her head." "No," Claire said immediately, but Richard kept his eyes on Ethan. "She was fine before you moved in across the street. She was not fine," Ethan said, and something in his voice made Richard stop. Not because Ethan was loud, he wasn't. He was very quiet, but there was something in the quietness that was not passive. She was managing. She was surviving. Those are not the same thing as fine, and somewhere underneath all of this, you know that. He kept his voice level, kept his hands still. "I didn't put anything in her head. I don't have that kind of power over her, and neither do you, though you've spent a long time operating as if you do. What I did was talk to her like she was a complete human being with opinions worth hearing. That's all. And if that was enough to change things, then that tells you something not about me, not about her, but about what your marriage has been." Richard stared at him, and Ethan looked right back. This was not a physical confrontation. Neither man moved toward the other, but there was a confrontation happening, a real one, in the space between them, in the air, that held all the things that had been said and all the things that hadn't. Richard finally looked away first. He looked at Claire. "I will contest the divorce." "I know," she said. "It will be long. It will be expensive. It will be difficult." "I know that too." "You'll have nothing," he said, and there was something almost triumphant in his voice, the last card being played, the one he had been saving. Everything in that marriage is mine. The house, the investments, the social network, all of it. You'll walk away with nothing." Claire looked at him for a long moment. "Richard," she said, and her voice was almost kind. "The way you are kind to someone you have already finished being angry at, because the anger ran its course, and what's left is something closer to sorrow. I had nothing in that marriage, a nothing that looked like something. At least this way, when I start over, I'll know exactly what I'm building and who I'm building it for." Richard looked at her for a long time. His jaw worked once. His hands came out of his pockets and then went back in. And Ethan watched him perform the final act of a man who cannot acknowledge defeat, the act of reframing it as something other than what it is. "You'll regret this," he said. "Maybe," Claire said, "but it'll be my regret. My actual, genuine, earned regret. Not yours. Mine." And then something happened that Ethan had not expected. Richard's face changed. Not into something ugly, not into something threatening. It changed into something that was for just a moment almost human. The mask not quite dropped but shifted, and what showed underneath it for just one unguarded second was not the man who controlled and managed and operated. It was a man who was genuinely, perhaps for the first time in a very long time, confronted with the full consequence of who he had been. He looked old in that moment, just briefly, just honestly. Then he looked at Ethan. "Take care of her," he said, quietly, without the edge. Ethan said, "She doesn't need me to take care of her." Richard absorbed that. He nodded once, barely. He walked back to his SUV. He opened the door. He got in. He sat there for a long moment without starting the engine, and Ethan could see him through the windshield, still looking straight ahead, and then the engine turned over, and the SUV reversed down the gravel road, and the sound of it faded into the distance, and the mountain went quiet again. Claire had not moved. She stood on the gravel with her arms still crossed, looking at the place where the SUV had been. Ethan walked over and stood near her, not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to be absent. After a while, she said, "How do I feel right now? I keep checking, but I don't know." He thought about it. "Like after a thunderstorm," he said, "when it's technically quiet, but the air still has all that charge in it." She considered that. "Yes, that's exactly it." She uncrossed her arms. "I thought I'd cry." "Do you want to?" "No, that's the strange part. I really don't." She turned to look at him. "Is that wrong?" "No," he said. "That's what happens when you've already done the grieving. You grieve the marriage for years before you end it. By the time you actually say the words, there's nothing left to cry about." She looked at him. "You sound like you know." "I know what it's like to have the hardest conversation after you've already made peace with the answer." She nodded. Then she said, "Ethan." "Yeah. Thank you." She stopped, seeming to realize that wasn't quite right. "No, actually not thank you. I don't want to thank you the way you thank someone for doing something for you. What I want to say is, she searched for it. You showed up, in the way that matters, not to fix anything, just to be present. While I did the thing I needed to do myself, and that means something different than thank you." He nodded. "I know," he said. "I hear you." They stood together in the quiet for a while longer. And then something changed again, because something new was moving in now where the confrontation had been, and it wasn't relief, and it wasn't peace, and it wasn't happiness. It was something more complicated and more honest than any of those things. It was reality. Richard was gone. The words had been said. The marriage was over in any meaningful sense, even if the paperwork would take months. Claire was standing on gravel in the Blue Ridge Mountains with a notebook inside and a mug going cold on the table and an entire life waiting to be rebuilt from the bones up. And the question she had asked 2 days ago on the dock, whether those bones were still sound, whether the grain was still there, that question was no longer theoretical. She had just answered it. But now came something harder than the answer. Now came what you do with it. She looked at the cabin door, then she looked at the road Richard had disappeared down. Then she looked at Ethan. "I need to call my lawyer," she said. "There's cell service if you walk to the top of the ridge." "Okay." She didn't move immediately. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "What happens now? Not in a, I'm not asking you to make a plan. I'm asking when you were where I am, when you'd made the hard decision and the hard conversation was done. What happened next?" Ethan thought about Sandra, about the hospital, about the room that smelled like antiseptic, about driving home for the last time, about opening the front door to the silence. You let yourself feel the size of it, he said quietly. You don't minimize it. You don't rush past it. You stand in the room and let it be as big as it actually is. And then, and this is the part nobody tells you, you find out that you are bigger than you thought, that you can hold more than you expected. She looked at him for a long time. Bigger than I thought, she repeated as if trying the weight of it. Bigger than he told you, Ethan said, which is different, and considerably bigger. She took a long breath and let it all the way out and turned toward the ridge. I'm going to make that call, she said. She walked up the path through the trees, and Ethan watched her go, and when she disappeared around the first bend, he stood for a while in the quiet of the mountain, and he thought about bones and grain and the things that survive what gets stripped away. Then he went inside and made 2 fresh cups of coffee, because she was going to need one when she came back, and she was going to come back. Not the same woman who had walked up that path. That woman was making a phone call that would change the shape of her entire life. She was going to come back having crossed the line between the life she had been living and the life she was choosing. And when she did, he was going to hand her a coffee and not make it mean anything more than it was. Because that was what she needed. Not a rescue, not a replacement. Just a warm cup and a person who knew how to be present without taking over. The afternoon was going to be long, but Claire Morgan was going to walk through it on her own 2 feet. And that was exactly what was supposed to happen. She was gone for 47 minutes. Ethan knew because he checked the clock on the kitchen wall when she left and checked it again when he heard her footsteps on the gravel coming back. 47 minutes on a ridge with a cell phone and a lawyer's number, and 18 years of marriage to begin dismantling. He had spent those 47 minutes doing what he was good at, working with his hands, keeping his mind occupied with physical tasks, not allowing himself to construct scenarios about what was being set up on that ridge. He finished the dock repair, he cleaned the tools, he brought in wood for the stove because the evening was going to be cold and he needed something to do that wasn't waiting. When Claire came back around the bend in the path, she looked different, not relieved, not devastated, not any of the things he had half prepared himself for. She looked the way a person looks after they have made a genuinely irreversible decision, and the irreversibility has settled in, not comfortable exactly, but solid. Like she had found a floor under her feet she wasn't sure was there until she put her weight on it. She handed him back the phone he'd lent her for the call. Her hand was steady. She picked up on the second ring, Claire said. Your lawyer? Margaret. Yes, I've been paying her retainer for 4 months and she's been waiting for this call. She sat down on the top porch step. We talked for 31 minutes. She said we're in a good position. Better than I thought, actually. Because I've been careful. Because I kept records. She paused. 2 years of records. Emails, financial statements, documentation of things he said and did, dates and contexts. She said it's more than she usually gets from a client at this stage. Ethan sat down on the step beside her. You've been building a case. I've been protecting myself, she said. I didn't know what else to call it at the time. I just knew that if I was ever going to have a real conversation with a judge or a mediator, I needed something beyond my word against his. And his word is very good. He spent 30 years making his word the most trustworthy thing in any room. So you built evidence. I built evidence. She leaned her head back against the post. Margaret said we should be able to file within the week. He'll contest it. She's already anticipating his strategy. He'll go for the narrative that I abandoned the marriage, that I was unstable, that I left without cause. She's seen it before with men like Richard. She says it usually falls apart in discovery because the documentation tells a different story than the narrative. Are you prepared for how long this will take? No, she said plainly. I don't think you can actually prepare for it. I think you just decide that the end result is worth whatever the process costs, and then you get in the boat and start rowing. She was quiet for a moment. Richard's going to make it expensive. He will. He's going to try to exhaust me, financially, emotionally. Margaret warned me. Long discovery periods, motions on things that don't matter, depositions that go longer than they need to. He's going to make the process itself a punishment. Can you handle that? She turned to look at him. I handled 18 years of the quieter version of it. Yes, I can handle this. He believed her. They had one more night at the cabin after that. One more evening, and this one was different from the ones before it. Not heavier exactly, but more weighted in the way that last nights always are, when you know the ordinary thing you're doing is also a kind of ending. They cooked again, they talked again. But underneath the talking, there was an awareness that tomorrow they would drive back to Asheville and the real work would begin, and the cabin and the lake and the 3 days of breathing room would become the past, a thing they had had once that had mattered. At one point, late in the evening, Claire said, "I need to tell you something and I want to say it clearly so there's no ambiguity." He looked up from the table. "Whatever I'm feeling about you about this," she gestured vaguely at the cabin at the space between them, "I am not going to act on it. Not now, not for a long time. That is a decision I've made deliberately, not because I'm suppressing something or denying something, but because I know myself well enough to know that if I move from one relationship directly into another, I will repeat the same mistakes. I will look for someone to define me again, because that's what I know, and I will pick someone and pour all this new energy, this new clarity into them instead of into myself, and I cannot afford to do that." She met his eyes. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" "Yes," Ethan said. "Are you okay with that?" He thought about it honestly. "I think," he said carefully, "that whatever I might feel about you is real enough that I want you to do exactly what you just described, because what you just described is you choosing yourself, and that matters more than anything I might want in the short term." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're a good man, Ethan Walker," she said. "I'm a man who's been broken enough times to understand what rebuilding takes," he said. "That's not the same thing as good, but I'll take it." She smiled, and the smile was warm and real and contained absolutely no complication, no ambiguity, no performance. Just genuine human warmth between two people who had been through something together and come out the other side with their respect for each other intact. They drove back the next morning. The drive home was quiet in a different way from the drive up. The drive up had been quiet with uncertainty, two people who hadn't fully committed to what they were doing, holding the weight of their choices carefully, not yet knowing what they would find. The drive back was quiet with completion. Things had happened. Things had been said. The shape of what was next was clearer, even if it wasn't easy. About 20 minutes from Asheville, Claire said, "I'm going to stay at Karen's. Your friend." "We went to college together. She's been telling me for 2 years that her couch was available if I needed it. I need it." She paused. "I'm not going back to that house. I'll get my things eventually with Margaret's help if necessary. But I'm not going back to live in it." "Okay," he said. Does that make sense, not going back?" "It makes complete sense," he said. "Richard will read it as confirmation that I abandoned the marriage. Let him." She turned to look at him. "You're remarkably uncomplicated about these things." "I've had time to think about what matters," he said. "Your safety matters. Your sense of self matters. What Richard interprets it as, that's on Richard's ledger, not yours." She nodded slowly. They crossed into Asheville proper, and the familiar streets came back around them, and Ethan could feel the weight of the ordinary world settling back into the truck cab, the way it always does when you return from somewhere that was outside normal time. He pulled up in front of Claire's house, their street, the familiar neighborhood, the houses they had lived across from each other in for 3 years. Claire looked at her house. The lights were off. Richard's SUV was not in the driveway. Whether he was inside or not, neither of them could tell. "Do you need to go in?" Ethan asked. "Not today," she said. "I'll text Karen and go straight there." She picked up her bag. Then she stopped. "Ethan." "Yeah. I'm going to be okay." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even entirely reassurance for his benefit. It was something she was saying to hear herself say it, testing the statement, checking its weight. "Yes," he said. "You are." She got out of the truck. She did not look back at her house again. She walked to her own car in the driveway, got in, and drove away. Ethan sat in his truck and watched her go, and then sat a moment longer in the quiet. Then he got out, went inside his own house, made coffee, and stood in the kitchen thinking about how strange it was that life could change this much in the space of 72 hours, and how strange it was that change, even necessary change, even right. Change always carried its own particular weight. What followed was not easy, and it was not fast. The first 2 weeks after the cabin were the hardest. Ethan knew this from the outside, looking in from the things Claire texted him in the evenings from Karen's couch. Short messages, nothing dramatic, just the kind of messages a person sends when they need to know someone real is on the other end of a phone. Richard had filed a counter-narrative with his own attorney within 4 days of their return. He was characterizing the marriage as stable Claire, as emotionally volatile, and the separation as unprovoked. His attorney was, according to Margaret, one of the most aggressive family law practitioners in Western North Carolina, expensive, methodical, and very good at making the other side feel like the ground was always shifting under their feet. Claire had 3 bad nights in the first week. She told Ethan about them, not asking for rescue, just telling him because he was the person she trusted to hear it, without reacting in a way that would make her feel worse. The first bad night was when Richard's attorney sent a preliminary discovery request that listed in clinical legal language every decision Claire had made or not made in the past 18 years that could be framed as evidence of instability. It was 43 pages long. The second bad night was when she found out that Richard had called her. Mother had driven to Charlotte and sat with her mother in her kitchen and had the conversation first, before Claire could framing the separation as Claire's breakdown, her unreliability, her abandonment of a good man who had done nothing but provide for her. The third bad night was quieter and more personal and harder to name. It was just the night she lay on Karen's couch and felt the full weight of the years she wasn't getting back. Not anger, just grief, the real, unadorned kind. Ethan listened to all of it. He did not offer solutions. He did not minimize. He did not say things would be okay in ways that were designed to make himself feel better about not being able to fix it. He listened, and when she needed a response, he gave her an honest one, and when she needed silence, he gave her that. One evening, about 10 days after the cabin, she called instead of texting, and when he picked up, she said, "Tell me something that has nothing to do with any of this." I thought for a moment. Then he told her about a chest of drawers he was restoring Walnut Federal period, probably 1810 or 1815, with the original brass hardware still intact. He told her about the way the wood had responded when he started cleaning the surface, the grain coming up almost amber under the oil, the way the piece seemed to gather itself back together under his hands as he worked. He talked about it for 10 minutes. At the end, she said, "I needed that. I needed something that was just real and physical and not about feelings." "The chest will be beautiful when it's done," he said. "Is there anything better than something old being made new again?" "A few things," he said. "Like what?" "Like someone deciding they're worth making new again." A long pause. "You're doing it again," she said. "What?" "Saying the furniture thing that isn't about furniture. Occupational hazard." She laughed, and the laugh had something in it that the previous 2 weeks of check-in texts hadn't had: genuine lightness, real amusement, the first sound she had made since the cabin that contained no weight at all. He thought, there she is again. Then he thought, stop. Because the most dangerous thing he could do right now for both of them was let himself confuse the connection they had, which was real, with something that was ready to be more than it was. She had said it clearly. He had heard it clearly. And more than that, he understood it in his bones, because he was a man who had learned the hard way that the right feeling at the wrong time is not a blessing. It's a complication you have to survive carefully. The following month was where the real transformation began, and it happened in increments that were small enough individually that Ethan sometimes didn't notice until he stepped back and looked at the distance traveled. The first thing she did before the apartment, before anything else, was she bought a camera. She texted him a photo of it. Nothing expensive, a mid-range mirrorless, but good enough to do real work with. The text said, "First thing I've bought with money that's entirely mine in a long time." It felt strange, in a good way. He wrote back, "Shoot everything." She did. She started an Instagram account, nothing formal, just her real name, nothing branded or marketed, just photographs. The mountains. The light coming through Karen's apartment window at 6 in the morning. A cup of coffee. An old man reading a newspaper at a diner counter. Small things, ordinary things captured with the particular attention of someone who has been looking at the world with new eyes after a long time of having her vision managed. Ethan followed the account on the second day. He didn't tell her he was following it. He just watched the photographs appear, one every day, or two, each one slightly more confident than the last, each one showing him something about how she was seeing things that words couldn't have told him. He thought the grain. He did not tell her he was following. He didn't want her to feel observed. He just watched, and it felt like watching something grow, which was one of the better things a person could do with their attention. The apartment came 6 weeks after the cabin. She texted him the address. 3rd floor, 2 bedrooms. She was going to make the 2nd bedroom a writing space, she said, and a photography workspace, same room. She had already mapped out where everything would go. He texted back, "That sounds like a room that knows what it is." She sent a string of laughing emojis and then wrote, "I'm learning to know what I am too." He thought good. Then two things happened in quick succession that shook what had been a slow, careful progress. The first was Richard. It was a Tuesday evening, roughly 2 months after the cabin, and Ethan was in the workshop when he heard a car in the street and looked up and saw Richard's SUV parked across from Claire's empty house. Not his house, parked in the street, just sitting there. Ethan set down his tools. He went to the doorway of the workshop and leaned against the frame and looked at the SUV. And the SUV sat there for about 10 minutes without moving engine running, and then it pulled away. He didn't tell Claire that night. He didn't want to alarm her over something that might have been nothing. But it happened again on Thursday, same time, same spot, and on Sunday. He called Margaret's office and left a message identifying himself as a neighbor and friend, describing what he had seen. Margaret called him back within an hour. She said this was consistent with Richard's pattern that he was documenting Claire's absence from the marital home to support his abandonment narrative, and that there was also a possibility he was doing it because he wanted to be seen doing it, because he knew someone would eventually tell Claire, and he wanted her to feel monitored. "What do you recommend?" Ethan asked. "Document every instance you observe," she said. "Date, time, duration. Don't confront him. Don't engage. Just document." He did. He also told Claire. She was quiet on the phone for a moment when he told her. Then she said, "Of course he is." Her voice was steady, but he could hear what was underneath the steadiness. Not fear, but the bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who has been in a long fight and can see that the fight isn't over yet. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm angry," she said. "And I'm tired of being angry about things that don't deserve my energy anymore. That's what he does, you know. It's still the same game. He creates situations that require me to react, and every reaction I have is something he can use or something that costs me. The whole point is to keep me spending energy on him." "So what do you do with that?" She thought about it. "I document, and then I go take photographs." He smiled at the phone. "That's a good answer." "I'm getting better at good answers," she said. But it was the thing that happened 2 weeks after Richard's drive-bys, that was the real shake. It was a phone call Claire got from her mother. She called Ethan the same evening, and he knew from the first second she spoke that something had hit hard. "She called me," Claire said. "My mother." "What did she say?" She said, a pause, and he heard her steadying herself. She said she didn't know how to say this, but she needed to say it. She said that Richard came to see her and told her about the cabin. "About me going to the cabin with you." A pause. And she said, and this is the part, she said she was worried about me, that I was making decisions that she didn't recognize, that I seemed to be, and she used his words, I could hear his words in her mouth. She said I seemed to be under someone's influence. Ethan was very still. "She said that," he said. "She said it," Claire confirmed. "My mother, the woman I have called every Sunday for 40 years, he got to her. He had a full hour with her in her kitchen in Charlotte, and he built his version of events, and he handed it to her, and she took it. And now she's calling me to ask if I've joined a cult or something." Her voice cracked on the last few words, not with tears exactly, but with the particular sharp pain of a betrayal that comes from an unexpected direction. "Claire, it's not her fault," she said immediately. "That's what I have to keep reminding myself. She's 71 years old, and Richard sat across from her and looked her in the eye, and he is very good at looking people in the eye, and she has known him for 18 years, and she trusts him, or she did, and I am asking her to suddenly believe that the story she has accepted for almost 2 decades is wrong. That's hard. That's genuinely hard." A long breath. "But it still hurts like hell." "Of course it does," he said. "I feel like she searched for it, like he's taken everything else, so now he's taking my mother. Like I'm looking around at the list of things that were mine, and one by one they're disappearing." Her voice was different now, not strong, not performing steadiness, just raw. "Ethan, I'm so tired." He didn't say anything immediately. He let the tiredness be real for a moment, without rushing to cover it with comfort. Then he said, "Can I say something?" "Yes." "The fact that you're tired is not evidence that you're wrong. People say, hold on, stay strong, keep fighting, and they mean well. But I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say that it is completely reasonable to be exhausted by this, and the exhaustion doesn't mean you made the wrong choice, and it doesn't mean you can't do this. It just means you're a human being doing something hard." She was quiet. "And your mother," he continued carefully, is not lost. She's been given one version of the story. You have a version too, and you are her daughter, not his wife, her daughter. That is a different category. That is a relationship he cannot rewrite no matter how good he is at rewriting things. He paused. Call her, not to argue, not to defend. Just talk to her. Tell her your version in your own words without asking her to choose. Let her hold both versions and figure out which one she knows is true, because she knows you. She has known you for 44 years. She knows which version sounds like her daughter. Bye. A long silence. What if she chooses his version? She won't, he said. But if she needs time to get there, give her time. Time is one of the few things Richard cannot control. Claire called her mother the following Saturday. She didn't tell Ethan what was said in that conversation, not in detail, and he didn't ask. What she told him afterward was this: her mother had cried, and then Claire had cried, and then they had talked for 2 hours, and her mother had said at the end, I raised you to know your own mind. I should have trusted that, and that was enough. It was 3 months after the cabin when the legal situation had its first major turn. Margaret called Claire on a Wednesday morning to tell her that Richard's attorney had made a settlement offer. Not a generous offer. Richard predictably had built his offer around the assumption that Claire would eventually run out of money or energy or both. But the fact that he had offered at all was, according to Margaret, significant. It meant his position was weaker than he had presented it, and it meant that the documentation Claire had provided, the 2 years of careful, meticulous record-keeping, was landing the way Margaret had hoped it would. Claire called Ethan from outside the coffee shop on Lexington, where she had been sitting when she got the call. Her voice had an edge to it that was new, not quite excitement, something more controlled than that, more compressed. He blinked, she said. Tell me. She outlined the offer. He listened without interrupting. What does Margaret recommend? He asked when she was done. Counter, firmly. She says we have leverage now and we should use it. What do you want to do? Counter, firmly. She paused. I am not settling for the version of my life he thinks I'll accept because I'm tired. I am tired. But I am not that tired. Good, he said. I need this to be over, she said. But I need it to be over right, not just over. Margaret knows what she's doing. Margaret is the most competent person I have encountered in this entire process, possibly in my adult life, Claire said with a warmth in her voice that made him smile. She looks at Richard's attorney's letters like they're mildly interesting crossword puzzles. I find that very reassuring. He laughed. Let her run. I am absolutely letting her run. They stayed in that rhythm for the next several weeks. Not daily contact, some days they didn't speak at all, and those days felt natural rather than strained, which told both of them something. The connection between them had settled into something that wasn't dependent on frequency. It was more like a structural element, something load-bearing, quiet, reliable, not prominent, just there when weight needed to be placed on it. And Ethan in those weeks did his own work, because he was honest enough with himself to understand that he needed to be careful. Not careful the way a man is careful when he's suppressing something he wants, but careful. The way a man is careful when he knows that what he is feeling is real and that real things mishandled break. I had feelings for Claire Morgan. He was not going to pretend otherwise to himself. He was not going to perform indifference, but he was also not going to move. Not now, not while she was building herself from the foundation up, not while the legal battle was active, not while she was relearning how to be alone without it feeling like loss. The timing wasn't right, and he was old enough and had been broken enough to understand that the right feeling at the wrong time can damage both people. He had seen that happen. He was not going to let it happen here. So he stayed where he was. He fixed furniture. He worked his dock. He texted when she needed him and gave space when she needed that. He followed her photography account and said nothing about it. I took his own trip to the cabin alone, 4 months after the trip they had taken together, and he sat on the dock and drank his coffee and thought about everything that had happened in the past months. About Richard driving slowly past the empty house, about Claire's voice when she talked about her mother, about the sound of her laughing on the phone about the walnut chest, about the way she had stood on the gravel and looked at her husband and said, "You gave me a cage." He thought about the woman who had shown up at the end of his driveway with a small canvas bag and said, "I think I need to breathe again." And he thought about the woman she was becoming, the woman who counterfiled through Margaret without flinching, the woman who bought her own camera and photographed the morning light. The woman who was day by day, in ways she probably couldn't see as clearly as he could, from his slight distance, becoming someone who knew exactly who she was. He sat on the dock in the early morning, and the lake was still, and the air was cold, and he thought, be patient. Not because patience was easy, because it was right. The dock held steady under him, the last plank solid, and new properly fixed, now repaired with care. Some things needed fixing quietly, some things needed time. And some things, if you were patient enough, and if the bones were sound enough, came back to themselves so fully that you'd hardly recognize the damage had ever been there at all. He finished his coffee. He went inside, and he waited. The settlement was signed on a Thursday morning in early April, 6 months and 11 days after Claire Morgan had stood at the end of Ethan Walker's driveway with a canvas bag and asked if the invitation still stood. Margaret called Claire at 9:43 in the morning, and Claire was sitting in her apartment at the desk in the room she had made into both a writing space and a photography workspace, exactly as she had planned when she first mapped the room out in her head. The desk faced the window. There were prints on the wall, her own photographs printed and framed. The first time in her life she had put her own work on her own walls without asking anyone's permission. The morning light came through that window every day at an angle she had learned to love, and she had been sitting in it writing when the phone rang. Margaret's voice was professional and warm, at the same time the voice of a woman who has delivered this particular kind of news enough times to know what it means to the person receiving it. "It's done, Claire. He signed this morning. Everything we countered on the financial division, the apartment, the intellectual property clause for your creative work, all of it. He signed." Claire sat very still. "All of it," she repeated. "All of it. His attorney called me at 9:15. I've been reviewing the documents since then to make sure there are no last-minute alterations. There aren't. It's clean. It's final." A pause. "Claire, you're free." The word landed in the apartment like something physical. Free. She set the phone down on the desk, not hung up, just down, and she sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the morning light coming through the window, and she did not cry, which surprised her, and then it didn't, because she understood by now that she had done most of her grieving already in the slow months of the process, in the 3 bad nights and the hard phone call with her mother, and the 47 minutes on a ridge in the Blue Ridge Mountains, when she called a lawyer and started the clock on the rest of her life. By the time the legal process ends, the emotional process has usually been going for much longer. The paper catching up to the person, not the other way around. She picked the phone back up. "Thank you, Margaret," she said, "for everything." "You did the work?" Margaret said simply. "I just showed you where to put it." After she hung up, she sat for another few minutes. Then she did something she had not consciously planned to do. She opened her notebook, the same one she had brought to the cabin, which she had since filled completely, and started a second one, and she wrote one sentence. She read it back. Then she closed the notebook and picked up her camera and went outside. She walked through her neighborhood for an hour, photographing things that caught her eye: a dog sleeping in a patch of sun on someone's front steps, an old man watering a window box from a second-floor apartment, 2 children arguing about something on a bike passionately and without resolution. Ordinary things. The stuff of a life being lived without drama, without management, without an audience. She photographed them because they were beautiful, in the specific way that ordinary things are beautiful when you are finally present enough to see them. When she got back to the apartment, she had 43 new photographs. She texted Ethan. Not a long message, just "it's done." His reply came back in under 2 minutes, "I know. Margaret's office called me as a witness reference this morning. How are you?" She smiled at her phone. He had known for hours and said nothing, waiting for her to tell him in her own time. That was so entirely him that it made something in her chest feel warm and clear. She wrote back, "Come over when you can. I have something I need to say to you in person." He arrived at 4 o'clock. She heard his truck in the street and opened the apartment door before he reached the top of the stairs, and they stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at each other. And there was no drama in it, no grand emotion, just 2 people who had been through something together and were glad to be in the same room. "Come in," she said. He came in. He looked around the apartment slowly, not intrusively, but attentively, the way he looked at things, the way a man who works with his hands looks at a space and reads it. He saw the photographs on the wall. He stood in front of them for a moment and said nothing. Just looked, and she watched his face, and she could tell he was taking them in seriously, not as politeness, but as genuine attention. "These are good, Claire," he said quietly. I know, she said. And she said it without self-consciousness, without the automatic deflection she would have used a year ago. Oh, I'm still learning they're nothing special, just something I do. She said I know because she had worked hard enough and looked at enough photographs and listened to enough of her own eye to understand that they were in fact good. I've been submitting to a local gallery. They want 4 of them for a group show in June. He turned to look at her. That's real. It is real, she said. It's a small gallery and a small show, but it's mine, and I'm putting my name on it. She had made coffee while waiting for him, and she poured 2 mugs and brought them to the small table by the window where she wrote, and they sat down across from each other. He waited. He was good at waiting. She wrapped both hands around her mug the way she always did, and she looked at him directly. I want to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond, she said. Okay. 6 months ago, I showed up at the end of your driveway with a bag I had packed the night before, and I asked you to take me somewhere I could breathe. And you did. And everything that has happened since the cabin, Richard, the call with Margaret, the apartment, the camera, the writing, my mother, all of it, none of it would have been what it was without what happened those 3 days. She paused. I'm not saying you saved me. I want to be extremely clear about that. You did not save me. I saved me. But there is a version of saving yourself that is almost impossible to start alone when you have been alone inside your own head for so long that you can't hear your own voice anymore. What you gave me at the cabin in the months after was someone who listened to me the way you listen to a person who matters. Not to manage me, not to fix me, not because you wanted something from me, just because I was there and I was worth hearing. Her voice was steady, but something in it was layered the way well-made things are layered. I needed to say that directly. Thank you, not for the cabin, for the listening. Ethan looked at her for a moment. You're welcome, he said. For what it's worth, it wasn't difficult. Listening to you has never been difficult. She smiled, and the smile was warm. Then it shifted into something more careful, more deliberate. I also want to say something else, she said. Okay. I told you at the cabin that I wasn't going to act on anything, that I needed time to be alone, to rebuild, to find out who I was outside of being someone's wife. And I meant it. I absolutely meant it. She looked at her mug, then back at him. 6 months is not a long time. I know that. I'm not naive about the math. You can't undo 18 years in 6 months. I know I still have work to do. I know there are days when I still hear Richard's voice in my head, the critical one, the one that says I'm being impractical or unstable or too much, and I have to actively choose not to listen to it. She paused. But here is what I also know. I was very still. I know who I am, she said. Not perfectly, not completely, but I know the shape of myself. I know what I value. I know what I want my days to look like. I know what I'm building and why. I know that the writing I'm doing is real, and the photographs on that wall are mine, and that when I go to sleep at night in my own apartment in my own life, I am not afraid of tomorrow. She looked at him. 6 months ago, I could not have said a single one of those things. Now I can say all of them. He waited. She said, I'm not asking you to be my rescue. I'm not asking you to be the next chapter of the same story. What I'm asking, what I want to ask if you're willing, is something completely different from anything I've ever asked anyone. What is it? He said quietly. I want to choose you, she said, not because I'm lonely, not because you're available and kind and I need someone, but because I have done the work and I have looked at myself honestly, and I have thought about what it means to be with someone as a whole person, rather than as a half a person looking for the other half. And when I imagine what choosing looks like from where I'm standing now, I keep imagining you. She took a breath. That is a completely different thing from what I had with Richard. That is the difference between needing someone and choosing someone, and I think you know that difference. I think you've known it longer than I have. The apartment was very quiet. The afternoon light had shifted while they talked, moving across the floor in the slow way that light moves when you're too absorbed in what matters to track it. Ethan looked at her for a long time. He thought about the morning she had appeared at the end of his driveway. He thought about the workshop conversation that had started it all, the question about bones and whether they were still sound. He thought about sitting on the dock in the cabin alone 4 months ago, drinking his coffee in the cold air, telling himself to be patient, telling himself the right feeling at the wrong time is a complication, not a gift. he thought, and the right feeling at the right time. He said, "Can I tell you something I've never told you directly?" "Yes." "That first week after we got back from the cabin, you texted me from Karen's couch. Short messages, nothing complicated, he paused, just keeping contact. And I would see those messages come in, and I would hold the phone and think, this person trusts me with the hardest version of their life. And that is the most serious thing a human being can do. Trust someone with their real self, not the managed self, not the performance." He looked at her steadily. "I have not taken that lightly. Not for a single day of the past 6 months." She held his gaze. "I know you haven't," she said softly. "And I want to be honest with you about what I feel because I think you deserve that. What I feel is real. It has been real since I don't know exactly when it became real. Maybe the workshop, maybe the morning at the driveway, maybe the first time I heard you laugh without performing it." He put his mug down carefully. "But what I also feel is that what you just said, the distinction between needing someone and choosing someone, that is the most important thing anyone has ever said to me in the context of this kind of conversation. Because I spent years with Sandra, good years, real years. I don't regret a day, and what made those years good was that we chose each other. Not because we were afraid of being alone, not because we needed to be completed, because we were two separate people who kept deciding each other was worth it." He leaned forward slightly. "That is what I want. Only that. And if you are telling me that you are standing on that ground, that you are choosing from wholeness rather than from need, then I am not going to pretend that I don't want to be chosen." She looked at him for a long moment. And then something shifted in her face. Not relief, not triumph, something quieter and more lasting. Something that looked like arrival. The particular expression of a person who has traveled a long distance and has just come in sight of the place they were trying to reach. "I'm standing on that ground," she said. He nodded once, slowly. "Then I'm here," he said. They stayed at the table for a long time after that. Not in silence, but in conversation, the kind that comes after something important has been settled, when the hard thing has been said and the ground has been found solid, and what's left is the ordinary and extraordinary work of two people beginning to build something real. She told him about the gallery show in June. He told her about the federal walnut chest finally finished, delivered to its new owner the previous week. She asked about the cabin, whether he was going again soon. He said he had been thinking about going in May before the summer heat. She said she'd like to see it again, in a different context, as a different person. He said he thought that sounded right. At one point, she got up to refill their coffee and stood at the kitchen counter and said, without turning around, "I wrote something in my notebook this morning, after Margaret called." "What did you write?" he asked. She came back with the mugs and set them down and opened the notebook that was on the table, the second one nearly half full now, and found the page and read it to him without preamble or apology. It was one sentence. She had written, "I am the woman I was before and more and mine." The apartment was very quiet after she read it. Ethan said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That's the one." "The one what?" "The sentence you've been working toward." She looked at it again. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I think so too." What happened in the months that followed was not a fairy tale, and it was not a simple story, and it did not unfold without difficulty. Real things don't. Ethan and Claire moved toward each other the way people move toward each other when they are both old enough to understand the weight of what they are doing, and careful enough to do it right, slowly, honestly, without the false urgency that comes from fear or loneliness or the need to fill a space. They had dinners that became regular. They had conversations that went late. They had disagreements, small ones, about real things, and worked through them without either of them collapsing under the pressure or going silent in the way that Claire had learned to go silent for 18 years. That she told him once was the thing that surprised her most. The way conflict felt different when it was between two people who were both actually trying to get somewhere, rather than one person trying to manage and one person trying to survive. He agreed. The divorce finalized in August. It was not the relief she had expected. It was something more neutral than that, a closing of a door that had already been closed functionally for months, the paperwork finally catching up to the person. She called him when Margaret texted her, and he said, "How do you feel?" And she said, "Like I've been carrying something for a long time and just set it down, and I know it's gone, but my arms still feel the weight of it." He said that was exactly right and it would fade, and she said she knew. The gallery show was in June before the divorce finalized, and it was a small show exactly as she had described it. 4 photographs in a group exhibition at a gallery on Lexington Avenue, the kind of show that doesn't get reviewed and doesn't launch careers, but matters in the specific way that first public things always matter, because they are the moment you stop being someone who does a thing in private and become someone who stands behind their work in front of other people. Ethan came to the opening. He stood in front of her 4 photographs for a long time, and he didn't say anything. And she stood beside him and watched him look at them, and she thought about the walnut chest he had described over the phone, the grain coming up amber, the piece gathering itself back together under his hands, and she understood something she hadn't fully understood before. He had been looking at her the way he looked at that chest from the beginning, not with possession, not with the intention to own the outcome, just with the patient, attentive care of someone who recognizes what something is capable of becoming and is willing to show up for the process without demanding credit for the result. She took his hand. He looked at her. She said, "Thank you for seeing it before I could." He said, "You did the seeing. I just stood in the right spot." She laughed, and it was the whole-face laugh, the real one, the one that had surprised itself the first time in his workshop doorway on a day that felt like 100 years ago and a week ago simultaneously. They stayed at the show until it closed. October came. The mountains turned the way they do in western North Carolina, hard and brilliant and without apology, the color announcing itself in the trees with a confidence that asked nothing back. Ethan planned his fall trip to the cabin, and he asked Claire if she wanted to come, and she said yes, and this time when they drove up the mountain road with the Blue Ridge rising around them, she was not a woman escaping something. She was not carrying the weight of a decision not yet made, or a life not yet chosen. She was a woman sitting in the passenger seat of a truck she had been in before going to a place she already knew, with a person she had looked at clearly and chosen on purpose. She brought her camera. She brought her notebook. She brought coffee and groceries and her own fishing rod, which she had bought in September and practiced with twice at a reservoir outside Asheville, with moderate success and considerable determination. The dock held steady under them both. On the first morning, while the coffee was brewing, Claire stood in the kitchen and looked at the table where she had sat 8 months ago and written in the first notebook for the first time in 9 years. She thought about that woman, the one who had packed a careful bag at 6 in the morning and stood at the end of a driveway with her heart loud in her chest and said, "I think I need to breathe again." She thought about her with tenderness. Not distance, the woman was still her, was part of her, the bones that had held through everything. But there had been so much surface work since then, so much careful, patient daily restoration. Ethan came in from outside and saw her standing at the table with that expression on her face, and he said, "What are you thinking?" She looked at him. "I'm thinking that the cabin wasn't where I found freedom," she said. He waited. "And you're going to tell me you already knew that," she said. "I suspected it," he said, "but I wanted you to find it yourself." "Where did I find it?" "Inside yourself," he said. "That was always the only place it was going to be." She nodded slowly. "Inside myself," she repeated, "and then I brought it here. And I brought it to the apartment, and I brought it to the gallery, and I'm bringing it wherever I go now because it's mine and it goes where I go." He poured 2 coffees. He set one in front of her. She picked it up. "You know what I want," she said. "What?" "I want to fish badly and write in the morning and cook dinner and argue about something small and look at the mountains and not have to explain myself to anyone." "I can do all of that," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I asked." They went out to the dock. The water was still and cold, and the trees had their color all the way down to the waterline. She sat with her fishing rod the way he had taught her, not trying to make something happen, but ready for when something did. Patient in a way she had not been 8 months ago, in a way she had been practicing since in life, and in this particular skill. He sat beside her. They didn't talk for a long time, and in that silence, not the silence of a person managing, not the silence of someone afraid to speak, but the full, inhabited silence of a person who has nothing to hide from and nothing to prove, and nowhere else they would rather be. Claire Morgan felt the last of the weight leave her arms, not all at once, not dramatically, the way good things happen when they're real, quietly, steadily, without announcing themselves. She sat on the dock with her rod in her hands and the mountains all around her, and the man beside her who had seen her grain when she couldn't see it herself, and had not once tried to claim the credit for the seeing, and she thought, this is what it is supposed to feel like. Not completed, not rescued, not finally fixed, just whole. Two whole people sitting on a dock in the Blue Ridge Mountains on a cold October morning, having chosen each other from a place of clarity, rather than fear, from fullness, rather than need, from the kind of love that only becomes possible after you have done the hard and necessary work of becoming someone you can live with on your own terms. The lake held their reflection steady on its surface. Two people, present, chosen, free. And that finally, after 18 years of disappearing inside someone else's version of her life, after 8 months of the hardest and most important work she had ever done, after a Thursday morning phone call and a sentence in a notebook and 4 photographs on a gallery wall and a fishing rod she was still learning to use, and a man who had never once tried to tell her who she was, that was the whole truth of Claire Morgan's life. Not the one Richard had written for her. Not the one Fear had been writing for years. Hers. Completely irreversibly bone-deep hers, and she was never going to set it down again.